So, I made a joke the other day on Distiller Stock with Christy, that, it's like everything, um, that, it's like everything else. We were on with Ted Bro and Richard Seeley. So if you want to do something different in the United States, you can kind of get away with it by McDonald'sizing it, right? So you just throw American in front of whatever you're doing. So, American brandy, American gin, etc. And so all those different categories have kind of had their time to grow now. So people understand that American gin is not going to fall into those traditional categories that we're used to trying, like London Dry, etc. And so American Absinthe probably isn't necessarily going to fall into that either, although it should stick to some traditional core aesthetic of what absinthe is and be recognizable as an absinthe, even if you are doing a little bit of a different take on it. I think that that's very much worthwhile. And I think now it seems to me from social media, etc., that people are paying a little bit more attention to absinthe now. And I think it took a little while for a lot of American palates to kind of come around to absinthe in a lot of ways, it seems like. So tonight I've invited Brian Cushing alongside my co-host, of course, Christy Atkinson. Brian is the what's the word you'd like to use there? The proprietor of the Victorian.
Yeah, the Victorian Bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've got Benjamin Eves from My Whiskey Den. And so we've brought these folks on because Brian is he's an expert in Victorian era cocktails in particular. And we brought Benjamin in because I trust Benjamin's expertise, and hopefully he can help keep me on the right track and keep this thing moving forward. Same thing with Christy. Christy has to do that all the time with me on Distiller Stock. So if it weren't for Christy, Distiller Stock wouldn't happen. That's for sure, because I'm not organized enough to make that happen in any meaningful way, shape, or form. I'm just lucky enough to get to hang out and talk to other distillers and ask them questions that I want to know the answers to more than anything else. So tonight we're going to taste through 3 different absinthes. So we have the newly released from Key West Smuggler, Death in the Afternoon, which is one that I've prototyped and Bill Hockett distilled. I actually have a guest here who helped me figure out the coloration on this, which is JL Garza. We're going to taste through the French Lick Le Bleu, and then we're also going to taste through the Fascination Street Absinthe, which I unfortunately forgot my bottle at work. So if one of you have a bottle and you want to show it off, feel free, please.
This one right here.
Yeah, but they're all 3 very different products, all 3 very different profiles. And I'm going to throw in a bonus for you, which is the Right Way rye whiskey that we actually aged in that Fascination Street Absinthe barrel. We'll throw that in at the very end. That's a brand new product, limited release as well. So I figure from there, it's probably a good idea to start with a little history of absinthe, maybe. And we'll just touch on basics essentially here. So Christy and I have been working on another project that we call The Veil, and that's going to run in different seasons. Each individual season is going to explore something else in alcohol history, spirits, distilling history, etc. So the first season is about absinthe, and we've tried to do a deep dive on that as much as what we can. Tried to be very diverse about it, talking to both traditional absinthe distillers as well as more modern distillers, as well as folks from the Absinthe House, etc., and then bringing in different stories about absinthe into that program. But the one thing that we've sort of looked at is the way that absinthe evolved over time and where it came from. And there's really no one original necessary root source for absinthe. You'll hear it attributed to a lot of different people, certain families like the Henriot sisters, etc. But if you look at the history of distilling overall, you will see that the 3 common herbs used in absinthe, so grand wormwood, hyssop, and anise, were very common phenyl anise, were very common throughout distillation for a long time, all the way going back even into early winemaking. You'll find that there are multiple different traditions that were using those different botanicals because that's what was available to them. So you'll see it a lot in aromatized wines, medicinal wines, sometimes even stone beer brewing. We're using those botanicals, etc. And it becomes a little more common in distillation in the 1600s to the point by the mid 1700s. You start to develop this idea of what absinthe really is. And absinthe really comes into its own in the early 1800s, reaches its popularity peak at the Belle Epoque, etc., and then all the way up to Prohibition. Unfortunately, absinthe was banned at one point in time throughout most of the countries in the world at varying different times. Each different country banned the product, and it was basically a disinformation campaign. So What really hurt absinthe the worst was that when phylloxera hit the grape crops in France and destroyed the winemaking region, everybody at that time was meeting up for happy hour after work. And when that wine went away, they needed something to replace it. Well, absinthe was the easy go-to. It was typically made out of a higher proof grape spirit traditionally, although it doesn't necessarily have to be. It has a little sweetness to it. You dilute it down. It's always been considered like an extract that you dilute down with water. So it's usually bottled at a very high proof because you're going to drink it at a lower alcohol percentage. And a lot of times you would dilute it with a little bit of sugar, although not necessarily. So that became an easy go-to for people who were wanting to have something after work to sort of relax, get their evening started. Unfortunately, it was incredibly popular. A lot of fake imitation absinthes were made using adulterants as different colorations that were poisonous at times, copper sulfate, etc. Very poor imitations were created. Not dissimilar to what happened in the early 2000s when absinthe sort of started coming back around. We all had this kind of idea of the mysticism of absinthe, and all these Czech Republic distillers were putting out basically poorly flavored and artificially colored vodkas and calling them absinthe. So it's mimicked itself throughout the years. But what happened very easily back in those days when the ban hit was that the winemakers were able to get together and they had to find a way to displace absinthe to get their place back, to be able to get wine back on the table. And so what they did is they started a disinformation campaign about absinthe being poisonous. They used the works of a doctor to basically say that alpha-thujone was a potential hallucinogen. It caused craziness. You know, there were stories about people murdering their family that were all attributed to absinthe, but really just over drinking in general was probably the major cause of that. So it was fairly easy for them to get a ban on absinthe in time. And unfortunately, all of those things were just fodder. There was no real substance to any of the claims whatsoever. And alpha-thujone, as an example, one of the constituents of grand wormwood, is not actually a hallucinogen at all. In high enough doses, it can cause you to have seizures, but you're never going to run into that in a bottle of absinthe anywhere. It's still regulated a little bit in the US by the TTB, as well as in the EU by parts per million. In the US, I think it's 10. I have to look again. The TTB's been right on the line with stuff here lately as well. In the EU, it's 30, 35. Interestingly enough, although they will test absinthe for alpha-thujone content, if you turn in a recipe to the TTB, you can go straight down to your store right now and buy sage oil, which is about 50% alpha-thujone by volume. So, you know, what's a little more dangerous, alpha-thujone and sage oil or alpha-thujone and absinthe? So that's kind of a little bit of a background for you, just to fill in some gaps that you might have. Now, what's happening now in the United States is that absinthe became re-legalized, and I can't remember the year. JL or Christy, one of you two might be able to chime in here. When things started coming back around, 2007, somewhere in there. Absinthe started to be kind of re-legalized. It wasn't re-legalized as its own category. It's been a distilled spirit specialty, which is kind of a gray area in regulatory terms. Unfortunately, there were a lot of bad imitation absinthes at that time. People got this crazy notion in their mind from watching all this popular culture that absinthe causes you to hallucinate. There was also really bad marketing, as I mentioned, from Eastern Europe at that time with these cheap, poor imitation absinthes. And when people got a hold of these terrible absinthes, they thought that that's what absinthe was. And so it developed its own negative connotation. Yet once again, despite the fact that things such as the Jade line were out there, there's definitely been St. George Spirits, Leopold Brothers, etc. Again, those are more Americanized absinthes. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So now that absinthe is starting to come back, some popularity is starting to come back to the forefront, how and where does absinthe go from here? And what can you do with absinthe that is interesting and different and draws people into the category? Because a lot of times people just tend to associate absinthe with that anise flavor. And a lot of people, especially in the Midwest, aren't big fans of that anise flavor. So if you're gonna try to introduce them to an absinthe, how do you go about that in such a way that you can kind of build their profile, build their taste buds into understanding those flavors, understanding how those flavors work, what they do in a cocktail, what they do, how it's properly served, you know, not setting it on fire or anything of that nature. but traditionally lushing it, and whether or not you use sugar or not to do that, and how you might get around that by distilling and adding some sweetness to it naturally. So I think that kind of covers that background and that history. Benjamin, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, brother?
Curious as far as, because when I look at some of the spirits, especially coming out of Eastern Europe, whether it's like aquavit and others that are anise based, where does absinthe actually depart from, or how is there a connection to those as far as distilling origins? It's curious if there's any ties there.
Yeah, there's definitely some interesting ties there. So the base of those botanicals typically is that they were used medicinally, right? And so everything starts out with, like with all alcohols, it all starts out as either a spiritual or a medicinal thing. And it's all about being able to use what you have available to you in your local area. So by the time that absinthe really becomes a thing, let's call it mid 1700s, and the Swiss Alps and Cuvée, those botanicals are commonly available, and they're being used in these sort of elixirs. And it's very closely related as well to chartreuse, or the idea of like elixirs of long life, different botanicals steeped in alcohol, which have those healing properties, especially in the GI. So the whole thing with absinthe is it was always treated as sort of an extract that was used to treat digestive issues, because all those botanicals have specific medicinal uses in digestion. So you'll tend to see those same botanicals used across the board throughout multiple different countries, multiple different cultures, multiple different products, because folk-wise, as far as folk medicine went, anywhere where those plants were at, they were commonly known as being used for those purposes. So at some point in time, it becomes a little more commercialized, where people aren't necessarily going after the medicinal traits of it as much as they are, the relaxation traits of it, the spiritual traits of it. My dog is invading the space. I apologize. So, but give me a second.
Well, I think this is a good spot right here. Oh, yeah. Adorable. I think this is a good spot right here, actually, for Brian to show us his first cocktail of the night before we get into talking a little bit more about Death in the Afternoon, which is going to be our first absinthe tonight. So, Brian, I'm going to pass this one over to you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to do it a little bit out of order. We'll do 3 cocktails tonight at least, and we'll do one with each of the featured spirits tonight. So my name is Brian Cushing. My area of research in the upcoming show is about drinks and drinking during the Victorian period. By the Victorian period, I mean 1837 to 1901, from when Queen Victoria inherited the throne from her uncle until she died in January of 1901. So a lot of people, they have one corner of it they pick. We're talking about the whole thing. We're going to focus a lot on America, though, and tonight we're pretty much going to be totally in the United States. And so what we're working with tonight is the result of a survey of bartenders' guides from 1862 to 1895. And the reason we started 1862 is that was the first time that the bartender's trade was really written down in Jerry Thomas. It wasn't the first time anybody wrote down recipes, but it's the first time somebody wrote down the whole trade. And then as you go along, you get this ever expanding selection of these books. And it's a really interesting look at the way that absinthe is being treated in the mid to late 19th century and how that changed. So right out of the gate with Jerry Thomas, it's very present. There's pretty much one recipe in there, is how to prepare absinthe. And there was no sugar. It was just with water dripped into the absinthe itself. And he actually said specifically, don't use a spoon. And I'm actually really surprised how seldom sugar does pop up in these. And so one of the challenges for me is to put absinthe into a context where it's not mystical, it's not a big deal. The only reason we have that is because it was illegal. All right, it was just an element of the Victorian bar, and so it starts out very present. By the time you get into the 1880s, it's all over the place, and it is its own main spirit in a drink and its ingredients in a drink. And so we're going to play with a little bit those two different elements of being the main spirit and of being just an ingredient. So I'm not going to cross the bridge of just of the classic French style of dripping water into absinthe with or without sugar. We'll talk plenty about that, and I'm sure there's plenty of debate out there about how that goes. We're going to look at some of the other ways that they prepared absinthe during the Victorian period, and we're going to start off actually really strong with my absolute favorite. This is the Absinthe Suzette from Theodore Preux in 1888. So really at the height of absinthe's popularity. We're going to use the Fascination Street for this one. The neat thing about the Fascination Street is how approachable it really is. Okay, I love absinthe. I'm usually a bourbon sipper, and this is a little bit, more like absinthe that's also sipping bourbon a little bit. So I like the approachability of this. It's a whole different experience. And what I found for adapting this to what the Victorians are saying in their cocktails to use, you can increase it by up to 1/2 of the proportion that they say. So it's very simple, but the results are spectacular. We're going to take 1.5 ounces, a jigger of the Fascination Street. We're going to take 2 teaspoons of anisette liqueur.
And we did have a question in the chat for anyone who's not watching there. But yes, we will be gathering the recipes from Brian and making sure that all attendees get them.
Yes, and I'll be sure they're adapted to modern people. And then just 1.5 ounces of seltzer water. You can substitute soda if that's what you've got. Put a little ice on it. And you just stir it up. Nice and chilled. It calls for a glass already chilled, and so we did that by just filling our tumbler with ice and water. Get rid of that. And strain. And this is similar to when they break it down in some of these manuals into the different styles of what they call the Italian style of mixing absinthe, except for that also has maraschino in it. This lacks the maraschino, but the result is just balanced and smooth and perfect. And quite honestly, every bit as wonderful as you get from the long wait from the drip. And it's, you'll hear me say this a lot. It's everything a Victorian cocktail is supposed to be. Everything flows together. Everything complements one another.
Nice.
The absinthe is just completely complemented and made graceful by just the right quantity of seltzer and the anisette liqueur. And so this, especially if you don't have the right equipment or the whole setup or something like that, but you still want to be taking part in the Gilded Age Belly Pock experience, the Absinthe Suzette is the perfect way to go. So thank you, and passing it back to Christy.
Yeah, so Alan, I'm going to pass this one back to you now because we're going to try Death in the Afternoon. Do you want to talk a little bit about the backstory on this one?
Yes, definitely.
And I'll show the bottle for everyone.
Yeah, so this is a Key West trading company thing down in Key West, Florida. Jim Martin and I were talking about doing an absinthe for a while, and Jim was pretty sold that he wanted a very traditional Verde style absinthe, and I had never done a Verde, so my background with absinthe starts.
Your volume just went, Alan.
How about now? Am I
better? You're perfect. Yep.
I don't know what happened there. Anyways, my background with absinthe, it's all basically Swiss style absinthe is what I've traditionally made. So starting at Copper and Kings and being involved in the 4 major absinthes that came from that facility. They're more traditional Swiss style absinthe, and then the various vapor infusions. So I've always wanted to make a Verde, and had just never really done it. But it became sort of a passion this past year. So Brian and I were working at Locust Grove, working on a project at Switzerland County, Indiana, where we found historic evidence of an absinthe being distilled by 2 separate distillers in Switzerland County in the 1830s, which is very early on in U.S. history for anyone to be making absinthe. For a long time, I thought I would be the first person in Indiana to make an absinthe, but as always, someone beat me to the idea by a good little time period there. So we started looking into those botanicals. We started looking into how to make this Verde style absinthe. The Swiss Blanche style is typically made a little differently from the traditional Verde style. Of course, Swiss Blanche is basically a clear spirit, so it doesn't have the post-distillation maceration step for coloration. But I really had wanted to get a little deeper into this Verde thing. To me, it was kind of a almost, I guess, a thesis statement as a distiller, right? So it seemed like one of those things like, I'm going to do that one of these days. I'm not quite there yet. This year was the year that I wanted to make that happen. It just so happened that Jim down at Key West was also looking for a Verde Absinthe at that point in time. And so we kind of hooked up on this project. And Jim's rules were very clear to me. He basically wanted me to come at this from a traditional sort of perspective, to look at what might have been available to Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Key West at the time, what Hemingway might have been familiar with in Europe, etc. And we did quite a bit of research on that. And what we found basically is that Hemingway really wasn't terribly particular about his absinthe. He would basically drink any absinthe that was really put in front of him, as long as it was an authentic, real absinthe, not a pastis or anything of that nature. So what I did is I looked at some old recipes for absinthe from several old distilling manuals, and then I touched base with some of my distilling friends, such as J.L. Garza, who gave me a little bit of a helping hand with the coloration portion, because that was something new and a little bit different to me. But this absinthe is the most traditional absinthe that you're gonna see here this evening. So this is very wormwood centric. It's very focused on the flavor of that wormwood and that anise, and that's really what we were after. It does use petite wormwood as well during the coloration process, as well as lemon balm and hyssop, but it is a very traditional sort of botanical bill for this style of absinthe. And as always, you know, we kind of thought that we might, just like in bourbon, you run up against sort of the purest sort of ideas. So when people hear that an absinthe is coming out of Key West, what the hell is that, right? That's what every traditionalist thinks. So this can't possibly be a good thing, especially they got a little kickback on the label originally, because there's the whole skeleton and skull and that whole idea of absinthe being poisonous, and that made a few people mad. But I think that they've kind of moved past that now, and it's been getting some really great reviews. But as far as a traditional absinthe, this is really the closest thing that I've ever made to a traditional absinthe. This is what it looks like after it's looshed down the traditional drip with the cold ice water. I usually don't loosh down as tight as what I did on this one. So typically when I'm looshing, I'll actually leave a little line of alcohol on the very top of it that stays clear. But I don't typically drink mine with sugar. And the goal with this was to create an absinthe that you didn't have to have a sugar cube for. So I wanted to be as traditional as possible, but I also wanted to have a sort of sweet anise forward sort of flavor. And I wanted to sort of check off all those boxes. And so for me, the fun of this project was, hey, it was something I was already getting into, something I wanted to do, something I felt like I needed to learn as a distiller. And I was able to partner with a guy that I really liked, Jim Martin. And then that project actually got distilled by my brother, Bill Hockett, up at Dayton Barrel Works this year. So it was a nice little three-way project, and then 3 different states involved: Indiana, Ohio, as well as Florida. And Jim's a Kentucky boy, so I guess technically Kentucky as well. But this has done really well for him. He's selling a ton of it. It's coming around. You can get it from, I believe, Cask Cartel. Is that correct, Benjamin?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yep. So it's out there and it's sort of making the rounds, and people are talking a lot about it. As far as something different, and as far as something that'll get you close to that traditional style of absinthe, this is there. And it was a nightmare to distill. So the distilling protocol on this was a little difficult on a prototyping still without any kind of agitation or anything of that nature. So this was actually originally prototyped on a little 3-gallon still over top of an open flame. And it took me a little while to figure out how to do that without any kind of agitation, because you didn't want to burn the botanicals or anything of that nature. The process of actually making the botanical spirit itself was quite a bit different from the Swiss process I was familiar with. We're using a higher proof alcohol to extract the botanicals. We're doing it at a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. And I'm pretty sure that Bill Hockett and his assistant distiller hate my guts at this point, because the day they first distilled it and they had to clean the still out, I got all kinds of pictures and fun
he was
messages.
a little vocal about his sinuses for a week thereafter.
Yeah. Well, it was, you've got almost as many solids in the still as you do liquid at that point. It almost becomes a solid state distillation, and it's a very delicate process to pull off. And I think that there are very few American whiskey distillers in particular, and that's not a knock against anybody, but that I think could really pull it off as well as what Bill pulled off that distillation.
I'm actually curious how many people, this is a newer absinthe, it's been recently released, but how many people here actually have it? If you want to hold it up, if you have it. There we go. So there's a few people. That's awesome.
Cool. So yeah, and it's very much got that it's got that wormwood to the forefront. I wanted that, a little bit of that bitterness to come to the forefront, but I also wanted that nice mouthfeel. That anise is there, but it's not as punchy as some absinthes are. And it's mostly green anise. There's a very small amount of star anise in here. So star anise wasn't traditionally used all that much, and it was kind of considered a little more inferior, a little more candy-like. So this is mostly green anise that you're going to taste on the palate, along with the Florence fennel alongside of it. And this one, it's a good one, and I'm extremely proud of it. There are a couple more absinthes that will be coming out of that project as well.
Ben, I see Ben's been drinking it over there for a little bit, but Ben, do you have some thoughts on it?
First off, this is the first go at it. So I just opened the bottle here. First pour, first sips, first nosing. I'm really impressed with it. My experience with absinthe is, I won't say limited. I've had a number of good absinthe, but this one is really on the palate. The way that hits the tongue and the mouth right at the front, I find is just absolutely gorgeous. And you get that fennel coming in, and then it just kind of shifts gears on the back end, and you get more of the sweet and more of the licorice notes. And on the nose, what was really hitting me was notes of mint and grass and lime right up front, and bay leaf, and then I got some fennel and bergamot, and then there's this sweet, almost rum-like agricole note that I think is kind of flowing through there. But this is just coming off straight. It's not watered down or anything at all. This is just beautiful. So
Kevin Rose just said it's 140 proof, so you have to be careful with it. And I wanted to comment that's because Kevin Rose is just drinking shots of pure absinthe, just having at it. So.
And I think Kevin Rose might have been pre-gaming too. So this one, what I love about it, Alan, I think you summed it up perfectly. This is one that definitely does not need any sugar. I like that you do get that wormwood, and you get it in the front and you get it in the finish too. It's like a really nice, clean, earthy finish. But I like that it has this mouthfeel that's almost like melting sherbet to me. It's sweet, and I like Ben. You mentioned the lime notes. I get those lime notes too. They're really coming to the front.
Yeah, for me. It's way more root beer, sassafras.
Sassafras, yes.
Than anise. That's what I get. So.
Yeah, the sassafras is definitely there.
And I also get the horehound that Kevin just commented on too. There's definitely that. What's interesting is this recipe didn't use any mint at all. So there's no mint in this particular recipe, although a lot of traditional absinthes have that. The other kind of interesting thing production-wise, as I mentioned in the intro, a lot of the early absinthes used grape spirit at 170 proof for their base. No lies, not covering anything up here. This is straight GNS base. So everything that you're tasting, everything that's been built out on this canvas is 100% botanical based. There's nothing here as a background spirit, no artifact from the original distillation whatsoever. But it is 100% corn-based GNS, which is an interesting canvas to use, because again, you have to deliver everything flavor profile wise, and as far as mouthfeel, it all has to come from those botanicals. And so that means that you really have to amp everything up and go at it as hard as what you can in order to get that flavor profile.
So before we move on to the next one, I'm going to toss it back to Brian for his second cocktail.
All right. So this one, we're going to play around with a little bit of absinthe as an ingredient versus as the main spirit in the cocktail. And the further you get into the period, like I say, once you get into the 1880s, this is happening a lot. Whereas in the 1860s, you mostly saw a mention of how to prepare absinthe, maybe with a part of brandy cocktail or something. By the time you get to the 1880s, they're incorporating absinthe into a whole lot of other things. In this case, it's in a Manhattan. All right. The Manhattan was something that came around at the end of the Victorian period. And it's as we're starting to crest from the Victorian style of mixology and what we think of as the classic style of mixology. And that's one of the things that really got me hooked on exploring the Victorian style, was when I realized how different of a character that it had. So we're going to, the neat thing about this too, I want to mention, this is by an author named Harry Johnson. And he was almost like, to me, the second Jerry Thomas. Jerry Thomas, he wasn't just the first. He was extremely well. He did extremely well at what he did. There were multiple editions of his book. It covered everything. Other people took his recipes verbatim right from his book. Harry Johnson, to me, almost picks that up in the 1880s His books are very comprehensive. His recipes are very well done. And there's an edition of his book that came out in 1882, another one that came out in 1888. 1882 is very much towards the Jerry Thomas end. When he comes back in 1888, we're still seeing early forms of these classic cocktails like the Martini and like the Manhattan, and called by those names, called by the actual names that we're used to. And so this is his version of the Manhattan. For glassware on this one, we're going to use a goblet. Not necessarily needed for the Manhattan, but when you see a lot of the images of people from the artwork of the 1870s and the 1880s, they're actually not using specially made absinthe glasses yet. They're using Victorian typical goblets like this. The profile look a lot like that. This particular one is a Capitola pattern. It was produced in either very late 70s or the 1880s. So glassware is from the same decade as the recipe. I'm gonna get some little ice here. There's a little bit more to it than a modern Manhattan. We're going to start off with 2 or 3 dashes of syrup, 1 or 2 dashes of Boker's bitters. This was extremely popular during this period, and you used to have to make it yourself. You can still do that, and a lot of bartenders actually did make it on their own. But there's a couple people out there now who have reformulated the Boker's. It has, if you taste it, you'll know it has a Victorian character to it. It's almost kind of like a Christmas tree, and its popularity waned solidly in the early 20th century. It didn't come back after Prohibition. So 1 or 2 dashes of that, and then our dash of absinthe. And we're going to use the Death in the Afternoon for this one. As soon as I tasted it, I was just impressed with its boldness and its character, and I knew right off the bat that it had the ability to perform in a cocktail like this, based rather than just on its own. So, just a good dash of that. Harry Johnson only specified whiskey for his. Of course, now we really think of rye being the classic for the Manhattan. People settle for bourbon and things like that, but kind of the sky seemed to be the limit with Harry Johnson. And since there's a debate between rye and bourbon, we're actually using Allen's excellent Matty Gladden high rye bourbon, the best of both worlds. There's going to be an ounce of that. Another note on Victorian measures, they state these things in wine glasses a lot. And so this is a Victorian wine glass. On average, they come in about 2 ounces. So if it says half a wine glass, it's an ounce. If you're at home without measuring equipment, an ounce is 2 tablespoons. So we'll just put our half a wine glass of the high rye bourbon in. Half a wine glass of vermouth, and you do want to use a dry vermouth in this one. I was always used to a classic Manhattan. It was probably my favorite classic mixed drink, using sweet vermouth. If you use sweet vermouth in this, it totally takes over. It's just kind of gross. But the dry vermouth balances everything out, and spend the extra couple of bucks on Dolan. It'll make all the difference. Stir it up.
So Brian, to make these cocktails, do you also have to make your own clothes?
Oh yes, and stitched even.
Yes.
And with this one, there is no maraschino cherry. We're going to work with a lemon peel, and so you just peel it off a good little strip with as little pith as possible. And all we're going to do is we're going to rub it over the drink. Okay, we're not going to leave it in. We're just going to let that essence just kind of settle over the top, and your customer's nose will be just gracefully met with it when they taste the drink. And so there you have it. This is an 1888 Manhattan. A lot more ingredients, I think, than we think of now. And it's very, very wet, very round, very rich, just like most of the things that Victorians like to consume in those days. It just has that character. You're definitely, you can see where the modern Manhattan came in, where it came from. This is the root of that, still solidly rooted in the Victorian tradition, though, before we fully round that corner to the classic era of cocktails in the 1890s. And so the Death in the Afternoon is just a little bit, but the perfect complement to this early Manhattan. So thank you guys, and back to Alan or Christy.
Very cool, Brian.
Alan, do you think we should move on to the Absinthe Le Bleu?
Yes. Yeah, let's go there. So this is the Spirits of French Lick Absinthe Le Bleu. So this is the first absinthe that we came out with at Spirits of French Lick. And again, I already had a little bit of a background in absinthe distillation at Copper and Kings. And I knew when I got to Spirits of French Lick in Indiana that I wanted to create an absinthe. But I wanted to stay in that same sort of style, that same sort of ideal. And the rationale behind that was I was really just kind of, competing with myself in a lot of ways, because there weren't that many clear style absinthes in the Ohio Valley. And I didn't want to mimic what I did at Copper and Kings, because again, I'm just competing with myself. So I wanted to do something that was a little bit different of a take on it. And the idea again here is that this is American absinthe, right? So this is not the traditional, my phone's gonna fall over, sorry. Traditional Parisian style absinthe, or even the traditional Swiss Le Bleu style absinthe that you might be familiar with. This is very much our own sort of thing. So in the Midwest, again, it's a little hard with those anise characteristics to get people who are really into absinthe. You might have 10 people come in, and out of those 10 people, one person may be really into the absinthe, and that's great. But how do you start to build the palates of people who aren't familiar with absinthe, think that it just tastes like black licorice as opposed to some of the other flavors that are happening there, especially in a bourbon-centric crowd, being in Southern Indiana, right along the Ohio River. We get a lot of those bourbon drinkers in. And so you're not gonna ever get 90%, 99% of traditional bourbon drinkers to go for a traditional French style absinthe. So what you do, in my opinion, or at least for this initial release, now there will be other things that come later on, is you lighten it up a little bit more. So take a little bit of that, what people would perceive as black licorice flavor, pull it back some. Don't do as heavy of a botanical load. Maybe you throw a little grains of paradise, a little black pepper in there. That brings a little more roundness, almost some of that sort of rye spice characteristic into it. Lighten it up in such a way that it makes good cocktails alongside bourbon. Brian and I have talked about this before, but doing split mint juleps. You do 1 ounce of absinthe, 1 ounce of bourbon, and make a mint julep with it. And they're wonderful with one another. You can do it with rye whiskey as well. But the idea is to sort of appeal to that American palate. So introduce some citrus characteristics. We also thought, absinthe has this sort of connotation of mysticism, as well as, the idea of the hallucinogen and all that stuff. So we threw some chamomile in there alongside some licorice root. And we also played with the base spirit on this. So instead of being 100% grain neutral spirit, or even grape spirit on this, what we did is we took and we made 25% of our base alcohol out of a whiskey that was 100% oat based. So those oats are they have a lot of long chain fatty acids. So they add a lot of mouthfeel. They're very rich. They're very full bodied. They're very creamy. They tend to coat the palate very well. It's going to be interesting with Benjamin and Christy, Brian, etc. You guys have all tasted this stuff, but it's interesting moving, kind of went backwards, right? So we started with the traditional, which is a very heavy, very, very rich, flavorful thing, moving over to the Swiss Le Bleu style that we did, which is a much lighter, much more almost airy kind of thing going on. It's not nearly as heavy on the palate. It doesn't hit you in the face with all those flavors up front. We've made the joke before, in the market, we called it Jaeger for pros. So, switch out the Jaeger and go for something a little bit better. But the idea here was that you could throw this into different cocktails and not be afraid to mess with it. Now it will still louche, as you might be able to see. I do have a fountain here that I've been playing with.
The color is amazing on it.
Yeah,
so it's almost like this lilac hue. It's very opalescent.
Mm-hmm. If you look, especially from the top, and I know you guys probably can't see there, but if you have it and you look from the top after you louche it, you'll notice that it's a little more transparent than what the Death in the Afternoon absinthe is. And that's because those oils aren't as heavy in this. So a lot of the louching that you're getting from this is actually coming from a little bit of the licorice root, as well as that base whiskey, being a double pot distilled whiskey and having a lot more oil in it in general. This is also the same absinthe that we used for the base for the Fascination Street. There will be other versions of this absinthe out in the future at some point in time. And again, I think it's a good beginner's absinthe. You know, it's a good way to get American palates used to what absinthe can be. And the idea is that maybe you buy a bottle of this and at first you're a little trepidatious about it. You taste it a little bit, you sort of become a little more familiar with that profile. You know, a lot of us, first time we try a new food, you go, I don't know if I like that or not. And then, you know, a few weeks later, you go, for some weird reason, I'm kind of craving that profile. And you go back to it. And then that's how you kind of build into that rabbit hole. So the idea is that this will build that flavor bridge for those people to maybe go a little further in depth into absinthe. And then moving from that into the next absinthe, you'll see that we even went even further after the bourbon drinkers.
So Alan, I'm curious if with Americanizing absinthe, so to speak, if playing with the base, the grain spirit is kind of the, I would say the next frontier of it, using different grains or different spirits or you know, different mashes, whatever, to come up with that base grain spirit for absinthe, like you've played around with this one.
I think that's going to be a lot of it. So with Brian and I, we worked on the Locust Grove project again. We used a double pot distilled corn whiskey because that's what they would have had in 1830 in Switzerland County, Indiana. At Copper and Kings, all those absinthes were very much Americanized. So even though it was a brandy base spirit, it wasn't a high proof, you know, grape spirit. It was double pot distilled. So Chenin, Colombard, and Muscat. I think that those base spirits can add a lot of complexity and a lot of character to something. They can bring a different sort of reflection to it. They can also be, you know, a reflection of the local food shed that the distillery's in. So, you know, if you're using an heirloom corn or you have a certain grape variety that grows well there, you're using rye, or, you know, we've even talked about the idea of using rum as a base, or a good friend of ours actually used some Kirsch that he made for a base for an absinthe. There's just an endless number of possibilities there. But I don't think it necessarily has to end there either. I think that playing around with botanicals that might be outside the ordinary. Now, if you go back and you look at the old, you know, antique absinthe recipes, you'll see a pretty wide diversity of botanicals. But I don't see any reason why absinthe shouldn't undergo what American gin has, where you go out into the local landscape and find botanicals that you can use in an absinthe. I mean, a great example, real simple, would be make something like a Le Bleu and throw some honeysuckle in a gin basket. You know, that would be an interesting aside that's quite a bit different and brings a new sort of American profile to it. I think everything is on the table as long as, in my opinion, you're trying to stay true to absinthe, but you're just doing it in your own way, without adding any adulterations. You know, just not adding any oils or anything of that nature. But just using those raw botanicals to get those flavors.
Mm-hmm.
So Alan, we have some questions popping up in chat. And I love that Tom Cole mentioned he's learning a lot of new words from us. Raymond Mays is asking, as someone unfamiliar with absinthe, what exactly makes absinthe different from gin?
So it's typically the main botanicals. So gin is, you know, traditionally it's juniper driven. Absinthe is, on the other hand, wormwood, anise, and fennel driven. Usually there's some other common herbs, hyssop, for example, and then lemon balm is pretty common. Petite absinthe, etc., for the coloration step. So they share a lot in common in many ways, as far as being botanical spirits, you know, flavored base alcohols from botanicals in particular. They both have a medicinal background. They both came from that same sort of time period, English a little more, you know, gin, and then more continental Europe, you know, on absinthe, especially France and the Swiss Alps, etc. But they're very similar to one another, at least in their history and their sort of applications. Although the flavor is typically entirely different. That said, some of the modern American gins probably lean a little bit more absinthe than they do really gin in a lot of ways, with some of the ways that botanicals are leaning. And also, you know, there is a absinthe that came from a British company that, you know, it's good that they did that because it's going to bring a lot of attention to absinthe, but it probably leans a little more gin than it does absinthe.
Yeah, there's another question from Kevin Rose asking about absinthe traditionalists, and are they accepting of Americanizing absinthe, or is that a battle?
I think most of them are. You know, they can.
And we had just had this question the other night too, like not really a question, but conversation with someone who, you know, very much is in the absinthe game, and you know, had a big part in absinthe becoming legal in the U.S.
Yeah, they kind of run the gamut. They're like bourbon people, right? So you can have your extreme snobbery on one end, which is that nothing new could possibly be good, you know, and that anything that bastardizes quote unquote absinthe in any way is not good. But I think that the vast majority of them are completely okay with it as long as you're respecting the tradition of what absinthe is. And so Ted Bro was a really good example the other night on Distiller's Talk. You know, with having this understanding of, it would be nice if we had a recognized category for absinthe through the TTB that met some basic standard of what absinthe is. You know, the same way that we have categories for you know, bourbon, etc., rye, etc., and to be able to build off of that. You know, we even have categories for gin and multiple types of gin. There's no reason why you couldn't have that for absinthe. And I think that most people are pretty understanding of that. And I think a lot of distillers, even absinthe distillers, get sort of excited by the prospect. So for somebody like Ted Bro, who we talked to again the other day, you know, his whole thing is that he wanted to be able to introduce a style of absinthe that was the original absinthe styles or multiple styles thereof, so that people would have an understanding of what absinthe was in the Belle Epoque. But he's also not opposed at all to what can be done with American absinthe in the future, and how you can play off of what was done then, take it to the next logical level there.
Yeah, I think as long as you're sticking to your base recipe and just playing a little bit, I mean, there are brands that really push the line a little too much. But as long as, you know, you're following your basics. Ben, what do you think about this?
Again, it's interesting because it's a real departure from the Death in the Afternoon, in my opinion. It's a little more subdued. There's a little bit of earthiness to it. And I think that's coming for me, the chamomile is sitting right on top, and it's kind of the anise and the fennel notes are more of a, like a cushion or a base layer that everything else is sitting on top of. But that chamomile is coming, especially on the nose, and even on the palate, it's coming right up front for me. But as Alan brought up about the oats being in there, the mouthfeel of this, it's got a really velvety, silky mouthfeel to it. That it really coats the mouth nicely. So you just get a good full burst of all the flavors when you take a sip.
And the nose is completely different on this one. Two entirely different animals.
Yeah, it's definitely an entirely different sort of animal. And it has been a good introductory piece for people with absinthe, the same way the Copper and Kings things work out. You know, you can kind of put those things that are a little lighter out there in front of people that they may even up front just tell you, hey, I don't like absinthe, or I don't like that particular type of flavor profile. And you can kind of put something like this in front of them, and they go, well, maybe there is something there that I like. I just didn't, you know, it's almost like sometimes that traditional absinthe style might be a little too much for a new drinker, because we're so separated from those old flavors, as Brian knows, working on these cocktails, etc. You know, we don't have the same palates that our great grandparents, our great great grandparents have, because everything has changed so much. You know, that anise flavor was predominant in foods across cultures, because it kind of gave that perception of sweetness, that gustatory illusion, that idea that, you know, that kind of, even when you're drinking absinthe, smelling it, it actually highlights the part of your brain associated with food, as opposed to the part that's associated with drinking. And so there is some familiarity there, even if it's just passed down genetically, whatever. But people need time to get used to it, and you have to kind of build to it to a certain extent. Now, again, if you make a true French style absinthe, and I don't think this was true even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, but I think Death in the Afternoon is proving it. You know, 5-6 years ago, I don't think that something like Death in the Afternoon would have been as big of a go as what this has been already. I think that it's taken these other American distillers building up this idea of what absinthe is with a lighter style distillate, in order for Americans to sort of come around to it. Now, that said, you know, I can't imagine a city in the world that would be, or in the U.S. in particular, short of New Orleans, that would be any more particularly primed for absinthe than what Key West is. I mean, Key West is where you go when you want to watch the rest of the world die, you know? So it just makes sense that it would work in Key West in particular.
So kind of bridging off of Kevin Rose's comment about, kind of Americanizing absinthe, let's go over to where we're pretty much bastardizing it a little bit with your barrel aged absinthe.
I love you, Christy. I love you.
I know you do.
So yeah, that's the Fascination Street, and so that's a fun little one-off label for us. There will be some more barrels of it in the future.
And do you want to explain the label too, because there is a story behind the label?
Yes, definitely. So we we do two different things at Spirits of French Lick. So the first thing that we do is we do a lot of history, obviously, and try to present historical characters on our mainstream releases or historical places to build those ideas back up in Hoosier history. But the second thing we do are these snarky little one-off bottles that are basically us breaking every rule that we can and flying the bird to every style of traditionalist in the entire industry from A to Z. And so the idea with the Fascination Street in particular was that we wanted to name that after The Cure, or I did, a Cure song in particular called Fascination Street. The ideal behind that is there's a line in that song that says, "I'm waiting on you to kick the last nail in," which is very much so, in my opinion. You drink 3 or 4 glasses of absinthe, and that's kind of where you're at. There's a little dystopia in all of us that might come to the forefront if you have a couple glasses of absinthe. So it fit perfectly, and we like to make playlists for these different products too. So that one is very sort of new wave centric in particular, that particular playlist. But we also wanted that cool apothecary scroll on that label. And Jolie Kasperzak did a great job designing that and bringing that idea to the forefront. We used a friend of ours, Mark Williams, who's an artist down in Lexington. He actually did that background that's on that label, kind of a metallic sort of background, kind of blue and green centric, kind of has some nice depth to it. But the idea with this was, again, let's bridge that gap between bourbon drinkers and absinthe drinkers. And so how do you do that? So what's the primary driver of Kentucky bourbon whiskey, right? So not necessarily craft whiskey, but Kentucky bourbon whiskey. It's the barrel. The barrel is really the primary driver of that style of distillation. That's a whole other debate for a whole nother time, but let's use that and let's mix that with absinthe and see if we can't bring some of those bourbon notes into an absinthe profile, some of those caramels, some of those vanillas, a little of that smokiness into a light style absinthe, which was the Le Bleu as the base, and see if there's not a bridge that can be built with bourbon drinkers. And that was probably pretty optimistic on my behalf, and I did not think that would do very well. I really just did it because I wanted to see what would happen if you put absinthe in a new American oak barrel, because I've never heard of anyone doing it.
AKA snark.
Snark, very snarky. Yeah, a little thumb in our nose at everybody, which is fun. That's the fun part of this industry and being in the craft. But it sold way better than I thought it would, and it got a lot more play than I thought it would. The beauty of that particular product is the barrel eats up a little bit of those heavier oils from the absinthe. They get held in the barrel, and we'll talk about that momentarily too. But you start to get these transformations in those long form fatty acids into these esters that become a lot more floral and a lot more rounded, not as sharp, not as jagged on the edges in particular. And we lowered the proof, and I don't have the bottle here in front of me because, again, I forgot it at work. It's either 106 or 108. I can't remember, guys.
It's 106.
Okay. So we took that down to 106 for a couple reasons. The first was that the idea was I wasn't going to have this be an absinthe that people were going to set down and use a fountain and loosh. This is going to be an absinthe that I wanted served more like either a bourbon or even a dessert wine, something you're going to have after a heavy meal. You're going to have it in a rocks glass. Maybe you have ice on it. Maybe you don't. You can do it either way, however you like it. It will still loosh to an extent, not entirely as heavily as what the Le Bleu does, because that barrel, again, is eating some of those oils. But again, I think that ceremony of drinking a bourbon makes more sense with this style of absinthe than the traditional ceremony of having a fountain or anything of that nature.
Now, there is one thing you haven't talked about yet, Alan, and that's the amethyst filtered.
Yes, so that's more snark. That's also me being superstitious. So and a giant fanboy. So I'm a bit superstitious with everything that I do, and I like to play off of that. Distilling is a very superstitious art to begin with. regardless of what tradition of distilling that you come from, there is superstition surrounding that. But the big thing with that amethyst filtration was, Dan Aykroyd did the whole Crystal Head vodka thing, and we're huge Dan Aykroyd fans. So, if Dan Aykroyd can filter vodka through Herkimer diamonds, I don't know why Alan Bishop can't filter some absinthe through some amethyst. And I'm not telling you that it'll do anything for you. The magic of that process is that it does whatever you want it to do. Whatever you think that it does, that's where its value lies at. I can't tell you that it improves the flavor of anything. I can't tell you that it decreases the flavor of anything, or hurts it in any way, shape, or form. But you know what I can say is I'm the first asshole who ever filtered absinthe through amethyst. So, for anyone who doesn't like it, they can put that in their pipe and smoke it.
Ben, how do you feel about this one?
I love it. I've been a fan of this one from the first time I've tasted it. Haven't had the bottle long, and you can see where I'm at. So I think it really does. It makes a nice bridge from what Alan was trying to talk about with a bourbon or a rye drinker to absinthe, because the notes I get right off the top are sassafras and orange and vanilla. And those are notes I classically think of more with a bourbon or a rye. There's bay leaf and cola, and then the anise, then the chamomile, then the wormwood kind of comes in, the fennel. But there's the sweetness kind of intensifies in a way, but in a different way. It's not like a sugar sweet, but it's more of a fruity sweetness. So again, like the sassafras, the orange, and there's a big vanilla note that comes in there. It just drinks really nicely. And I will tell you this, it's lovely on the rocks. Just a nice big piece of ice. And yeah, man, just let that slowly melting in there and infuse it. It's fantastic to sit and sip on after dinner or something. And this is another one, a little bite of dark chocolate and then a sip of the Fascination Street, and it's just magic in your mouth. So
yeah, it starts with this nice creaminess, and then it gets a little effervescent. Yeah. I really like this one, and it's definitely meant to be, just drank just like this. It's perfect.
It also goes great with lemon cake, just so you know.
I can see that. I mean, I think this would go well with a cigar, to be honest.
It's actually really good in a highball too, just a standard highball with like ginger beer or ginger ale. It's fantastic. But that's that's for a Saturday night when you got nothing going on for at least 24 hours. You're gonna lose a Sunday for sure. All right.
So we have Brian does have one more cocktail, and then after that, we're actually going to switch over to questions. So cool. Brian, I'm going to pass that over to you.
Great. And just to echo something that Alan said about the appetite, and another thing that he's always saying is that a lot of times they knew that something worked, but not how they worked. And a lot of these Victorian manuals and guides, they do recommend absinthe before a meal because it stimulated the appetite. So going back to what Alan said about actually being processed as food. Another use during the Victorian period that repeatedly gets recommended is as a morning drink. Okay, so it's part of the Morning Glory Fizz or the Morning Glory Cocktail, depending on how they're mixing it. It's not quite a precursor to the Corpse Reviver, but it's kind of the same idea. It's a good way to start the day. Also, there was some advice in the late 1880s. If you were inebriated the night before, waking up and having a cocktail with a considerable amount, quote, of absinthe will calm your nerves. So the cocktail in the Victorian period actually was a subcategory of mixed drinks in general. These days, if say we're going out for cocktails or something, it's going to encompass the whole gamut of mixed drinks. For the Victorians, a cocktail was a certain category, and it was a pretty simple mix of your sugar or syrup, bitters, spirit, and some citrus. And that goes way back, and then you might switch it up a little bit, but once you start putting other ingredients into it, then you're into the area of what they call fancy cocktails. So we're going to go and we're going to do an absinthe cocktail today. And the absinthe cocktail didn't come right out of the gate. In the 1860s, when these guys really started, you had pretty much whiskey, brandy, gin, cocktails. By the 1880s, when absinthe is just booming and they're incorporating into everything, by then they decided we're going to do an absinthe cocktail too. And so it's really pretty easy. And again, You don't have to have the special equipment to enjoy it this way, but it's still completely correct to the Gilded Age, the Belly Pock. We're just going to do 4 dashes of our syrup, 3 dashes of bitters, and Angostura. This is 1888. No, this is 1882. I'm sorry. Angostura is actually an option for this. 1 ounce of absinthe. And we are using the wonderful Le Bleu for this one. Just 1 ounce of water. This one gets shaken over ice. Strain. This one also is garnished with lemon peel. But for this one, we are going to squeeze it over the top. Let's get the essence on top, and we'll go ahead and leave it on there. I don't know if you can see, but the bitters with the milky white spirit give this a nice kind of candy pink color to it, a rich kind of candy pink. And again, it's got kind of the balance of the regular preparation of absinthe without really the trouble. Everything plays together really nicely. The aroma of the bitters with that just subtle citrusiness over this, like everybody was saying, it's really nice mouthfeel, approachable. Absinthe is just a really nice, really authentic way to take it. And so highly recommend this. This is just the absinthe cocktail, very much related to the other forms of cocktails that the Victorians were recommending at that point. And since I have the floor, I can't resist. I'm going to break my own rule. We're going past 1901. It's 1930s, and we're going to do Death in the Afternoon with Death in the Afternoon, or as Amy likes to call it, Death of an Afternoon. A jigger, however much you're comfortable with, of the absinthe in a champagne glass. Fill the rest of the glass with the champagne. As you can see, you have just a lovely yellowish, greenish, hazy mixture there. And absinthe and champagne are just the perfect marriage. The Death in the Afternoon doesn't play around. It has just the most wonderful, subtle sweet on the front tip of your tongue as the champagne washes over your mouth. Hemingway recommended having 5-ish of these in slow succession. So you can do as you please. Like Alan says, you might want to have a full Saturday and a Sunday after that to really, if you want to do the full experiment. But this is the classic Death in the Afternoon with the Death in the Afternoon, and it is highly recommended. So
I'm pretty sure.
What's that?
Pretty sure that's where Hemingway came up with that hashtag "Get Weird with Absinthe."
Yeah, this would definitely be a nice Saturday afternoon drink if you didn't have anything else to do. So once again, I want to thank everybody for having me on tonight to share some of these cocktails. It's been a great exploration. These are wonderful folks, and I've just really enjoyed the whole journey with you guys.